for attending this webinar on the movement to combat racial profiling of Asian Americans today. My name is Vivian Chung, and I am the program coordinator for the Anti-Racial Profiling Project here at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and I will be your moderator today for this webinar. We are very excited to be hosting this event today with OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates, and I want to thank them for their work in organizing this important webinar with us and for their partnership in our week of action to end racial profiling of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. This webinar will consist of a two-part panel, with the first section providing a comprehensive overview of the anti-racial profiling movement, as well as the current state of play. And with this being our week of action, the latter half of the panel will center on ways you can get involved with Advancing Justice, AAJC's, as well as OCA's week of action. And I want to first introduce you to our esteemed speakers today. For the first panel, we first have John C. Yang, President and Executive Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We have Mara Hisendal, a reporter at The Intercept. We have next Jingliang Cai, the board chair of United Chinese Americans and the founder of Tennessee Chinese American Alliance. And to complete the first panel, we have Ron Yang, professor at the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at the University at Albany, the State University of New York. For the second panel, we have Tu Nguyen, the Executive Director of OCA Asian Pacific Americans Advocates, as well as Gazela Perez-Kusakawa, Staff Attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And I want to quickly mention that there will be time at the end for each panel for questions. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box or chat box at any time during the webinar. But for legal and privacy purposes, I do want to note that please do not discuss your personal situation or provide any facts related to an investigation or pending litigation during this webinar. Okay, without further ado, I would like to start our first panel today. And my first question goes to John. So John, could you provide us with an overview of the anti-racial profiling movement overall and kind of the current state of play here? In addition, if you could also share with us what the long-term vision of this movement really looks like and what the Asian American and even broader civil rights community should do to support.
Great. Thanks, Vivian, and thank you all for tuning in to this webinar and learning more about this. Frankly, probably if you're tuning in, my guess is that you already know something about this issue. So I'll be relatively brief in summarizing where we are and then really talk a little bit more about where we're going with this. You know, where we are, as you probably know, the racial profiling of Chinese and Asian American scientists is not new. You know, we could trace the history to Wenho Li, Sherry Chen, Xiaoxing Xi, any number of individuals in the past. I suspect Mara will talk with much more greater expertise than I will about all of that. You know, what we saw though is in 2018, with the announcement of the so-called China Initiative by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, it took it to a different level. And what I mean by it took it to a different level was that now there was a specific targeting of Chinese American scientists and professors on so-called economic espionage threats, so-called trade secret thefts. And we saw a reaction by our community, the Asian American community, in creating fear and distrust of both the government and about the circumstances, the environment in which we were sitting. And so it was at that time that a number of organizations, OCA, APA Justice, run by Jeremy Wu, our organization, Advancing Justice AAJC, and the Brennan Center, all came together and started talking about this issue and thinking about how do we address it head on. Because what we saw frankly was racial profiling in the same way that Muslim Americans were racially profiled after 9/11, in the same way that Americans of Japanese descent were incarcerated in World War II because of these so-called dual loyalties that sometimes pop up. And so at that time, we initiated what we called an anti-racial profiling project to focus in on three things. One is to just educate our community about what their rights are. Two is to advocate on behalf of our community as to what changes we thought were necessary. And three is to make sure that they had our community had the legal representation that they need during this period. First, in terms of education, just making sure that we knew what was going on, that people knew their rights. Essentially, that if the FBI came knocking on your door, you had a right not to say anything to them. You have a right to an attorney. That even if you are confident that you did not do anything wrong, that there are potentially legal peril that you can get into if you start speaking to the FBI and unintentionally making a misstatement of some sort. So it's that sort of education. It's education of the public about this issue and education of the media about sort of this issue and the effect that it was having on our community. Second, it was in terms of advocacy, in talking to the government. Now, we started this project in around October of 2020. So it's right when the elections for the president was happening. And frankly, with the new administration, the Biden administration, there's been a different tone set. There are still challenges with respect to how they're thinking about this geopolitical threat posed by the Chinese government. But at least the rhetoric, some of the rhetoric around Chinese and Asian American scientists and Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in general has shifted. So now we've taken to talk to the White House, to talk to DOJ, members of Congress, NIH, NSF, about these issues, about these concerns that we have, and think about how we strategically move forward on this. Now, I want to be clear about one thing here, is that we fully recognize that there are real legitimate geopolitical threats posed by the government of China. Whether you talk about the human rights violations with respect to the Uyghur minority, the Muslim minority in Xinjiang province, whether it is with respect to democracy in Hong Kong. And there are many things that we have to be concerned about. And yes, economic espionage, trade secret theft is among those concerns. But at the same time, even while we address those concerns at a government-to-government level, we need to be careful. And this is where our community needs to come together to ensure that people's civil liberties are protected, people are not profiled, our community is not over-criminalized for some of the things that are happening. So that's where the advocacy comes in. And the last component is with respect to legal representation. As we started talking to all of you, our community, the community of scientists, the community of professors, one thing also became clear was that they needed legal help. Specifically, when they understood their rights, when they understood that they didn't need to talk to FBI, when they understood that they needed an attorney, we wanted to make sure that they had an attorney that was sufficiently experienced to handle these types of very complex criminal defense cases. And specifically here, like AAJC, our organization is not equipped to provide that sort of direct representation. But the reality is there's a whole network of experienced criminal defense attorneys that can handle these cases. So our job was to make sure that these impacted individuals, the scientists, the professors that were being contacted by FBI, DOJ, had a resource that they could go to, can have a referral to an attorney that can help handle their case. So those are really sort of how our community is thinking about these issues, what we're trying to do with this anti-racial profiling project with respect to what we're asking. So where are we going from here? What we're asking for is a stop on the China initiative. What we see is that this China initiative is not being effective at what it is designed to do. With respect to the cases that have been prosecuted under the so-called China initiative, a majority of those cases have actually not involved economic espionage or trade secret theft. Rather, they've involved cases such as what we would call failure to disclose, where a professor has failed to disclose a particular grant, failed to disclose collaboration with a Chinese university that was requested sometimes on these forms with the university. Now, I say sometimes because even here, frankly, the rules are unclear and the rules have been changing over the last few years. And so for our community, what we are saying is that it makes no sense under these particular circumstances to criminalize that behavior. Could there be employment consequences? Yes, there could be. But that is a different issue than suggesting that these individuals are spies or these individuals are trying to steal secrets of the United States to benefit the Chinese government or the Chinese economy. So that's what we're trying to do in stopping the China initiative. More generally, if we think about what we're trying to do, is making sure that our community is protected. They're not racially profiled, that these are addressed in an appropriate manner. So where are we now? I mean, we've seen a couple of things. One is the acquittal of Professor An Minghu in Tennessee, which I think Cai Jingliang will talk about, where we saw the first China initiative case end in an acquittal of that professor. We have another case coming up, Dr. Feng Tao in that will be taking place in the beginning of December, and making sure that the community shows support for him during that time. We also have seen the confirmation of Matt Olson just in the last week for the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division. One of the things that we've been told by the Department of Justice, in fact, Attorney General Garland talked about this at open hearings last week, was that he is going to ask the incoming National Security Division Assistant Attorney General to take a look at this China initiative, take a look at their policies around this issue and see what recommendations they have. So we're going to hold them to that and have dialogue with them to try to think through what's a smarter strategy for addressing these issues. So that gives you a quick overview of where we are, some of the things that we hope to accomplish. And we'll talk further about how we're looking for support from all of you to elevate these issues, to talk to your members of Congress, to help send letters to the members of Congress, talk to the media, so that people know that this is an issue that is affecting not just the Asian American community, but the scientific community and scientific research as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for providing this comprehensive background on the movement to combat racial profiling against Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, and also providing that context and information on where we're heading and the future of this movement, right? So my next question actually goes to Mara. And Mara, so you have been one of the first journalists who has written quite a bit on the racial profiling of Asian American scientists, researchers, and scholars, including cases that predate the China initiative. And so could you share with us how you got started in covering this issue and your views on how coverage on racial profiling has changed, including if you have any concerns regarding misinformation, disinformation, on how these cases are being reported?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. I don't think I can claim to be one of the first journalists to cover this topic. There's the great, the late Iris Chang, whose book "Thread of the Silkworm" was a great resource for me when I was researching my own book. But I got interested in this issue because I was previously a correspondent with Science in China. And so, a lot of my work involved going into the field with Chinese scientists, interviewing them, usually about the research. I was not so deeply involved in politics or in counter-espionage stories. But then I started to see case after case coming in the US, and these indictments being announced often in very hyperbolic language, and scientists were being made out to be extreme national security threats, and I recognize that there is a whole range of cases at issue here, but some of the problems that we see in the China initiative were in place years ago. So I first started looking into this in 2013, I believe, and then reported my book, which is called "The Scientist and the Spy," on one particular case that played out over the years to come. And I also did a fair amount of research on historical racial profiling, and through the Freedom of Information Act, obtained documents showing that the FBI had a program dedicated to surveilling Chinese scientists going back to the 1960s and continuing into the 70s, possibly the 80s. And that was pretty, the ambition there was to develop an index of every ethnic Chinese researcher and even student in the United States. And so, let me talk a little bit about media coverage of this issue and how it's shifted over the years. Issues with media coverage date back years. One of the central problems in the Wen-Ho Lee case was that he was named as a suspect before he had been formally charged. And, that was something that then played out in court and everything that followed sort of started with him being named prematurely. But that's not an isolated case. I still sometimes see people named before they're charged in articles involving cases connected to China. And so some of the issues in current day coverage have been there for years. When I first started reading coverage of trade secrets theft and economic espionage cases, one thing that stuck out at me was a kind of dehumanizing language. I think this is a problem with criminal justice coverage in general, that indictments are accepted as fact, and journalists will sort of repeat the language in the charging documents without sufficiently reaching out to the defendant for comment or the defendant's lawyer. This struck me as particularly a problem in trade secrets theft and economic espionage cases. So I noted language comparing defendants to animals in some cases, like calling them locusts in a swarm. So this is also about this idea that there was a kind of horde of ethnic Chinese researchers who were trying to steal technology in the United States. And related to that, one of the only cases where I could find a defendant had really presented their story in a detailed way in the press was that of John Reese Roth, who was a white professor from the University of Tennessee, who went to prison for, I believe, for violating Arms Control Act. And that treatment was rarely given to ethnic Chinese defendants until Xiaoxing Xi and Sherry Chen came along, and that really changed things. Then suddenly and this is partly, as far as I understand it, a decision that they made and that their lawyer Peter Zeidenberg made, to really tell their story in a meaningful way in the press. And so you had one day 60 Minutes running a piece that kind of ran with this Chinese spies are everywhere narrative, and then and then also turning around and giving lengthy interviews to I believe Xiaoxing Xi and Sherry Chen. And those cases really opened up a dialogue about some of the abuses and more misguided charges that have been brought. And I think in the past few months and the past few years, we've seen a shift where there's more of a recognition that there are issues with the China initiative. And I think this is partly due to the activism of groups like AAJC. But there's still a ways to go. And, just to wrap this up, I would say that one persistent issue that I see in the media is a conflation of espionage and economic espionage and grant fraud. These are three very different things. They do get lumped together under the China initiative, so it's not just journalists' fault, and they get lumped together by DOJ officials and by others. But there is a big difference between somebody spying for an intelligence service, and it's a very serious crime, and somebody misrepresenting information on a grant application. It's still a federal crime. Still, many people are being charged with it, but I think we need to go further in terms of really laying out what it is that people are and are not accused of doing. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, thank you so much, Mara. And absolutely, I think your perspective as a reporter and as a writer, both, this is definitely very informative. And thank you for kind of sharing your concerns and what you're seeing, today in the media coverage right now. And you mentioned activism of Asian American and faculty academic groups. So my next question will actually be for Ron. So Ron, I'm aware that just this week, a coalition of about 2,000 faculty and scientists of Asian descent from 14 universities sent a letter to President Biden sharing their concerns about the China initiative. Could you speak a bit more to that and also discuss kind of more broadly, what are some of the impacts you're seeing within the academic community?
And
you're on mute.
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here to join everybody to discuss this issue. I think in spring, University of Michigan Association of Chinese Professors, they reach out to several other universities, and they form a somewhat loose and alliance. And then the first webinar for discussion on this China initiative issue, I think maybe in early June. And about 22 people attended the webinar, mostly are professors. And I can see that everybody is in fear and is in despair and also is angry, okay? And then we think, there must be something we can do. We cannot just sit here and let it happen, right? So we must do something. And then after a while, we think that maybe the thing we can do now is to write a letter to the lawmakers, to have a direct dialogue with the lawmakers who are making the laws like China Initiative. So that is the motivation for writing this letter. And in the process of writing this letter, we got help from all professors. We have linguistic professors helping with wording and punctuation, etc. We have a law professor checking on legal issues. We have scientists from climate change. We have a political science professors. It's a joint work. This letter is a joint work. It represents a common call. Now, if I have time, I prefer to go over some parts of the letter, if it's okay with you. Vivian, was it?
Please do. Please do.
So I will share my screen with you. Can I share? Right now it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
You should be able to share now.
Can I share now?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess most of the people in the media may not have read the letter yet. So let me just go over some parts of the letter which I think are the key takeaways from this letter. First, we are a coalition of nearly 2,000 Asian American and Asian immigrant academicians and scientists at 14 universities. And we thank President Biden for establishment of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and for the signing of the COVID-19 Hate Crime Act to protect Asian American community. And then the letter recalls the contributions of Chinese Americans and immigrants to the United States. since the mid-1800s, Chinese Americans and immigrants have made significant contributions to our country's advancement in economy, education, infrastructure, science, and technology. And in the 21st century, Chinese American and immigrant scholars and scientists also constitute a major driving force behind emerging fields such as artificial intelligence, bioengineering, biomedical research, climate change research, cybersecurity, data analysis, nanotechnology, and renewable energy. Now, we point this out because maybe many of the lawmakers are not aware of the contributions we are making. So this is important that they are aware of this fact. And then the letter highlighted several recent cases, like the case of Dr. En-Ming Hu, Sherry Chen, and Gang Chen, and the Franklin Tao, and Dr. Xiaoxing Xi of Temple University. So those are the high-profile cases that occurred recently. And then the letter talks about the chilling effects. So that is the effects we were feeling when we were in the first webinar. You know, the group of 22 people are talking about what to do. So we clearly are in fear. So we feel the chilling effects of these prosecutions. And those chilling effects have become widespread. So many scholars and scientists are forsaking scientific collaborations with counterparts in China, including those on medicine, climate change, pandemic, and environmental protection, which are critical for all humanity. And many have become hesitant to apply for federal funding due to security and compliance concerns, which could effectively terminate their research programs. Many have stopped recruiting talented Chinese students and visiting scholars who otherwise can be vital to the functioning of their labs. And many are leaving this country due to fear of unjust treatment. So these are just a few of the chilling effects, and we make that clear in the letter. And then the letter urged the White House to take prompt actions in making necessary remedies. First, end the China Initiative. Targeting a specific racial group not only is unconstitutional, but also risks leaving a gap for real perpetrators to harm our national security. Under the umbrella of the White House initiative on AAPI, create measures to safeguard Asian American and immigrant scholars and scientists' human rights and academic freedom in the face of federal investigations. The third, make necessary and timely compensations to individuals and families who have been traumatized by unjustified prosecutions. Number four, to increase transparency, include current China Initiative-related cases in White House briefings on national security issues. And number five, increase oversight on law enforcement to prevent future selective prosecutions and human rights violations against scholars and scientists. And at the end, I think there is a message to the policymakers. China's fast ascent into a global economic and a technological power has created new geopolitical tensions with, challenges to, as well as opportunities for our country, adding further complexities to the relation between the two nations. However, policymakers shall always keep in mind that our greatest asset in this long race. So the letter emphasized that the race is going to be a long race. There's no short-term fix, and the small tricks don't help. Now, what is our asset, the greatest asset in this long race with China, maybe other emerging countries? It is the innovative power fueled by the world's most comprehensive higher education system and unparalleled academic freedom. So this is the message we want to deliver to the lawmakers. And in the end, we strongly believe that an academic climate promoting open international collaborations and an education environment welcoming diversified and talented international students remain the pillars of success for maintaining our nation's global lead in science and technology.
Thank you so much, Ron. And I believe that this letter is currently open for organizational endorsement sign-ons. Is that correct?
Thank you. I haven't checked yet.
Oh, yeah. So I'll go ahead and share that link with everyone in the follow-up email once the endorsement for sign-on is open. But Ron, I also wanted to see if you can touch a little bit on kind of the impact on the academic community, if you want to speak a little bit to that.
It doesn't have much impact on pure science. My field is pure mathematics. It's at the level more like philosophy, art, and music. So it doesn't have a direct impact on me personally. But I was elected as a president for our university's Association of Chinese Professionals. And we have communications with many members on campus. I can see and feel the same kind of fear that I felt in that first webinar. And remember, those are esteemed scholars and scientists. These should not be subject to that kind of fear.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ron. And if you could just kindly unshare the screen, I've also dropped the link to your letter in the chat box so folks can give it a more thorough read. And my next question goes to our final panelist, Jing. And as a community leader who has worked closely with community groups to mobilize on-the-ground advocacy efforts for Professor Anming Hu, the first case to go to trial under the China Initiative, and you did quite a bit of work locally in Tennessee. I want to see if you could share a bit more on how you got involved, your experiences throughout that whole process in organizing on-the-ground efforts, and also how other local groups can engage in some of these similar efforts to support impacted scientists.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity. My name is Jin Liang Cai, and I live in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm currently the board chair for the United Chinese Americans. It's a national organization founded 4 or 5 years ago by more recent immigrants from China. And I'm also, last year, actually during the last election cycle, there has been a lot of rhetoric that really in Tennessee, really the heartland of the United States, where you have very few Asian American or Chinese American. So it's really a very small racial minority, but there has been a lot of rhetoric about our state, congressional representatives, so on and so forth. So in Tennessee, we have some pretty, I think a year ago, there has some very derogatory remark made by our senator that has caused a great stir among the Chinese American community. So we, people leaving Tennessee wanted to make sure our voice are heard. So we connected with other Chinese associations in Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and we called ourselves the Tennessee Chinese American Alliance. And we started really to organizing, protesting, in Nashville, and writing a letter to our congressional delegations and tell them what impact their rhetoric has made, to us, and also same thing, our contribution to Tennessee, to the United States. So that coalition really was reactivated this summer as we hear more about what's going on with Professor Hu's case. So we want to rally and mobilize our community really to make sure we have a voice at local and state levels that really tell the Tennessee public, American public, what we're seeing and how unjust we have felt that Chinese has been discriminated against, particularly in Professor Hu's case. And so we have received, really a lot of initially reluctance from Chinese American community because of the fear factor. We all heard from the professor earlier. So we really try to say, hey, in the United States, you're accused of a crime doesn't mean you committed a crime. So you have to have the court is the place you prove the crime has actually committed. So all we're trying to do is that to make sure we hear from the, really at the court, so you can hear exactly with your own ears as far as what happened, okay? And you can't trust a lot of the media reports and so on and so forth because that's not fact. So that it really has certainly allowed us to mobilize a pretty good turnout in Knoxville. There are about 50-some people from around Tennessee, went to Knoxville and listened to the court proceeding. And also we wanted to make sure that we understand the case, what's going on, the racial profiling aspect is really unjust, unfair, unconstitutional, un-American. So we want to make sure the public, local media, and especially where it's happening in Eastern Tennessee, in Knoxville in particular, know that we have a voice and we want to make sure they heard our voice. So we also organized a press conference with the wife of Professor Hu, Ivy, in front of the courthouse on the first day of the trial. So since the trial, of course, a long wait, and but even after the acquittal, we continue to work with representative congressional offices in other cities in the Tennessee, and really what we heard in the court, and also has been real documented by the judge, that Mr. Hu was definitely unjustified, unfairly prosecuted. So we want the local congressional, our representative, to know what happened. So we continue to reach out to them to make sure they put pressure on DOJ to investigate the gross misconduct by FBI agent and by the prosecutors. So all these effort, I think it's also part of a national effort. Part of the UCA, we have at the national level, there has been many rounds of fundraising for many of those accused professors. Professor Hu, Tao, Chen Gang. I can count at least half a dozen of them. So over the last year, and hundreds of millions, which hundreds of millions, but hundreds of thousands of dollars has been raised to support them, assist them in to defend their civil rights. But at the end of the day, we hear a lot of letter writing, rhetoric, so on and so forth. I think it's my personal experience involving Professor Hu's case is this. I think until you are there in Knoxville, you meet him, you know what he has been going through. It is really heartbroken to me to see how a very esteemed professor was accused by, falsely by FBI agent, and then he lost his job. He was house arrested, not allowed to leave his house, go to grocery stores to get his really daily living activities, okay? Of course, he can't go to really his family, and also how heartwarming the community has been in Knoxville, that people step up to offer moral, financial, and really life support, right, to keep him housed, fed, so at least he can sustain his fight for his human right. But I think at the end of the day, it's a human right for many Chinese Americans. So I really, at the end, I want to say that I know there's more cases going to happen in Kansas, and I certainly hope the Chinese American community and as well other community in Kansas that recognize that it is important that we are involved and make our voice heard in those communities, so that this kind of gross injustice cannot stand, okay, in our backyard.
Thank you so much, Jingyang, for sharing your experiences and especially your heartfelt words. And then in addition to that, some of the best practices for on-the-ground advocacy efforts that you and all of the Tennessee local groups have led. I do want to highlight here, as Jingyang mentioned, if you are in Kansas or the surrounding area, we encourage you to sign up to attend the upcoming trial of Dr. Tao, and we'll be providing a sign up link in the chat box. So now we will move on to our first Q&A session. And if you haven't already done so, please submit your question in the Q&A box or even in the chat box here. And again, just want to mention that for legal and privacy purposes, please do not discuss your personal situation here today or provide any facts related to an investigation or pending litigation during this webinar. And I can kind of start off with a first question, and this goes to all the panelists for this first panel, and you can definitely, answer them from your particular expertise. But what are some of the ways, and I think you guys briefly mentioned these already, but just for I know we have a lot of community groups, as well as even student groups here in the audience today. What are some of the ways we can effectively combat racial profiling of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants? Through community mobilization, through the academic community, through policy and advocacy, and media.
Well, Tsai, do you want to go first? Jingyang, do you want to go first?
Okay, sure, absolutely. I think it's Professor Rong, was it Rong, who really had some great contents there. We love to use that content because at the end of the day, we are not scientists, we're not researchers, but really it's important, I think, for local community to reach out to their own congressional representatives, being that congressman or senator, because they respond to constituents, okay, more than respond to some total stranger, national letter, whatever it is. So I think we have to use, it doesn't really matter how many people you have in your community you want to get involved, but I'm just saying, as a constituents, we must do our job and then find out who represents us in the Congress, okay? And we need to go to use the information that Ron has. And then plus whatever our own, people, you got campuses, University of Memphis, University of Tennessee, Nashville, Vanderbilt. I know there's many universities that has university towns where there are many Chinese American researchers and scientists. And we got to go to knock on the doors of our congressional representatives and do the hard work of really lobbying and let them know what's going on. And this thing I don't mean it can only change, but the thing is will play a huge role, right, to turn this tide around. Okay, so because they are representative for us. Okay, so we got to use that that power of us as a constituents of elected officials to do the hard work.
The other thing I would suggest is certainly for those of you, whether you're students, professors, or scientists that work in the university system, let your university know how you feel, right? Because the universities unfortunately have not always stood up for the rights of the professors and of the students and of the scientists. And that needs to change. I know that some of them feel like they're stuck between the proverbial rock and a hard place, because when FBI comes knocking on their door or DOJ comes knocking on their door, they're not sure what to do. But if they don't hear from you all that you sort of how this is affecting your research, how this is affecting sort of what you do for the university, remember that your work is for the benefit of the university's prestige, then they're going to have more of a tendency to just roll over for the DOJ. The other place that I think would be useful is for those of you that are affected, think about whether you're willing to tell your stories, right? Because when we have someone like Sherry or Professor Shi that can tell their stories, Doctor Who's wife has been telling her story into the media. That's incredibly powerful, right? Because on one level, we need the data. And so some of the data we've been able to talk to members of Congress, members of the administration, but the personal stories also changes hearts and minds in terms of understanding the personal impact that's having. So for those of you that are willing to do that have been impacted, reach out to us. And we can certainly help you to figure out how to best story.
Yeah, I would add as a member of the media, I know that there are discussions playing out within media organizations over how to cover this issue. To a member of the public, it can seem confusing why, one day you have a story that says this and another, there's a story that seems to take a completely opposite stance. And it's because there are often very heated discussions among journalists over how to cover sensitive issues like this. I know because I've been a part of them. And, I think it's important to keep having those discussions. We've had them publicly about how to cover race, and in particular, how to cover police killings over the past 18 months. But I think we need to keep having those discussions about the China Initiative cases as well.
Yes, please go ahead, Ron.
Yes, I think there is a question in the Q&A section by Malcolm Lee, and he's asking what impact are these targeted enforcement policies having on America's ability to attract and retain ethnic Chinese STEM and other students. I would just give you an example that I personally experienced. It's about maybe 2017. I was visiting a Chinese university and gave a lecture. And a female student, was sitting in the audience. And after the talk, she said that she's very interested in the material that I was in the topic that I was talking about, and would like to come to the United States, and in particular in our university, to study as a PhD student. So she applied, and of course she has to gone through the rigorous screening in competition with some other students. And it turns out that she was ranked #1 in the pool. So we sent her I-20 as an offer, and she has to use this to apply for American visa. And it was delayed by several months, and then on top of it, another several months. So she missed the fall semester. And then she said, can I just reapply and then come in spring? And our department says, yes, we'll be waiting for you. So if you come in spring, that's fine with us. And she applied for visa again and did not get a visa either. So in the end, she stopped, the trip, and she went to a Chinese university to pursue her PhD. Now, this is just one example. She's a top-ranked student in our pool and was not able to come and study here because of the concern of security issues.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing that. And I think we do definitely have heard many of similar stories, unfortunately, of immigration barriers. I want to move on to another question from the audience. And this person mentioned that I am African American. Besides continuing to doing the work of learning histories and actually building genuine friendships, what else can I do to be an ally? I also work with Asian American students. We're very much like to encourage them to get involved. What are your thoughts on those?
I would say, if to the extent you're comfortable, speak up, right? And if you think about sort of what allyship, at least what allyship means to me in these types of moments, it's to the extent that we could sort of relieve some of the burden of the impacted individuals to have to defend themselves. So what I mean by that is, for example, I'm thinking about how I can be an ally to the African American community. And one of the places here is like oftentimes an African American will get asked, frankly, unfairly in my mind, they'll be asked, well, why does Black Lives Matter? Why do you insist on using that phrase? Instead of forcing that African American to justify that phrase or explain it, it should be incumbent on me to explain, well, here's why it matters to me. Here's why it should matter to all of us, right? So that's how we show some allyship. And likewise, in this sort of space is when people are talking about racial profiling of Chinese Americans, or if people start to give misinformation about, how all Chinese are spies, or that they're going to just benefit their so-called home country. If it's a non-Asian American, non-Chinese American that speaks up, it has a different power, it has a different resonance. So those are the places that I would ask, or I would suggest that allyship can make a difference.
Thank you, John. Would anyone else like to comment quickly on that? Or else, I think we're also getting. Oh, Jingliang, did you want to comment?
No.
Okay. I think we are actually running up to our time to begin the second part of our panel here. So yes, if you would like to have any other questions for us, please feel free to email us. I'll be dropping our contact information, this LNI's contact information in the chat box if you're interested in getting involved, signing up for the trial for Professor Tao, as well as if you are interested in even drafting a letter similar to university groups from Young for Ron, and petitions, comments of that sort. So I want to thank you to all the panelists who participated in the first panel. And of course, you're welcome to stay on and listen in for the second panel. And so the second panel actually will be very more action focused, on focusing on how you as an individual can take action. And this week is our first week of action in this movement. And we are very grateful to have so many organizations join efforts in calling for an end to racial targeting and profiling of our communities, including the partnership with OCA, Asian American Pacific Advocates. So I am actually now going to turn to Tu Nguyen, the Executive Director at OCA, for our first question. And Tu, could you share your organization's work and involvement in combating racial profiling, as well as the local chapter's engagement on this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. We're incredibly grateful to have such wonderful partners like Advancing Justice AAJC, this week of action, and just a long-term effort to combat racial profiling. Just shows how necessary it is that there is constant collaboration between advocates and organizations in order to push back against these systemic issues. So while Advancing Justice AAJC brings the litigation and technical know-how in terms of like conducting legislative visits and advocating to the administration and Department of Justice, OCA works more on the community and education side. And we work to educate the general public on why cases such as Professor Hu's or even Sherry Chen's are important to pay attention to and what we can learn from them, right? For those of you who don't know, OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, is a national membership-based civil rights nonprofit with over 50 chapters and affiliates across the country in 24 states. So while, in the past year or two, we've been doing anti-Asian hate work to address the physical and verbal attacks on Asian Americans out in the streets, it's important to understand that the discrimination through these targeted accusations and racially charged rhetoric, right, like the China Initiative, is in fact also considered anti-Asian hate, right? And only in this case, the anti-Asian hate is carried out by like federal and educational institutions. And so there's a gap kind of in public understanding as to how dangerous this China Initiative is and how dangerous the continued rhetoric can be to the API community. Even within OCA, our members didn't really realize like how close of a threat they and their members were to being a target until they heard from some of our own chapters who have been doing advocacy for a while now, right? And I wanted to share some examples. So for example, OCA Greater Houston, back in 2019, MD Anderson had let go of several Chinese American scientists, and those investigations had lacked transparency and due process. And this is all due to FBI's, going after those they deemed, as security threats. And so the local OCA Greater Houston chapter stepped up to speak out to the media, as well as speak with MD Anderson leaders and other local leaders, such as the local FBI office, on their concern about how these investigations were being done. They provided support to the victims, some of which were OCA members like Helen Xie, who is a faculty member at MD Anderson. And even before that, between 2016 and 2018, that was when Sherry Chen case had happened, and OCA Greater Houston had partnered with the Committee of 100, which is also one of our partners here in this effort, to host panel events and trainings for scientists and professionals on how to protect themselves and what actions they can take to prevent them from being targeted as and accused of espionage, right? I also want to call out, OCA Central Virginia. One of our executive council members there, Eric Lynn, has been doing a lot of advocacy work because in Virginia, we have Senator Warner as the chairman of the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence, which plays a really important role, right, in advocating to combat racial profiling. And so Eric Lynn has developed a really good relationship with Senator Warner's district office, continues to advocate and bring constituent stories to them, but also, he connects as a constituent, he connects the work that AAJC does, the work that OCA does nationally to the senator, right, and brings it up, constantly brings it up. So you see kind of a theme here, right? Over in New Jersey, another executive council member, David Lynn, has also been, conducting legislative visits and collecting constituent stories, right? And so we see this theme of like telling your story and conducting legislative visits being incredibly important. And we're excited that, OCA chapters and partner organizations are engaging in this effort. Moving forward, we look to continue our rapid response trainings, which we've been giving in the past year to give community leaders a breakdown of the exact steps that they need to take to respond to such incidents, like who should you reach out to, what kind of information should you be gathering. Jen mentioned a press conference. How can you put that together and provide our members and constituents with updates on what the progress is with combating the rhetoric around China Initiative and what communities may be targeted next, right? But I want to double down on, the most important thing coming out from OCA is our collection of stories from the community and their testimonials so that we can present to our Congress members why this issue is so important to us and the danger that it poses. So I want to shout out to the OCA chapters who are participating in this week of action: Cleveland, Westchester, Hudson Valley, Fairfield County, Greater Phoenix, Tucson, Greater Los Angeles, Greater Sacramento, San Diego, Orange County, Detroit, and Greater Houston. I know there's plenty more OCA chapters out there, so this is also some pressure and encouragement for you all and any other affiliate to sign up. It's not too late to sign up to participate in the Week of Action.
As always, thank you so much too for your organization's efforts and continuous support. We're so appreciative to be working with a great organization as well as great chapters like you all. So my next question actually will go to our second and final panelist, Gazala Kusakawa, who is the staff attorney of the Antiracial Profiling Project and Immigration at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. So Gazala, a lot of folks have been asking as well as how they can get involved in our Week of Action and other efforts to help support the movement overall. Could you share with us on how organizations, community members, and individuals, even students, can take action? And in addition, could you also shed light on some of the top policy and advocacy priorities that would be really helpful in pushing back against racial targeting of our communities?
Well, thank you so much, Vivian. And like to mention, a lot of this is about collaboration, right? We know this is not something that just one or two organizations can work on. And two, it's been a pleasure to see how hands-on you've been on this and your team, and to see leadership from folks like Eric, David, and Roland, and many others on the ground for your chapters. Just today, we were able to have a big showing with one of the congressional offices that includes voices from impacted persons, students, professors, and local community organizations. It was wonderful to see how the enthusiasm and passion from the participants in advocating on this issue really impacted the staffers. We know it is very personally draining to share a story and to advocate for your local community, but it's so impactful in creating lasting change. So we're so grateful for the folks who have undergone our training, who are choosing to speak out this week, but also to speak out all throughout of November, right? We have a goal here at Advancing Justice AJC and with OCA to really push forward on educating folks this year, right? So this week, this month, it's about all of us coming together. It's not the end. We still have these next 3 weeks of November and some time before the holidays to really make sure that we have our partnerships and collaborations between different civil rights groups, community members, and impacted persons, and have a strong front in a lot of these legislative meetings. So we really want to emphasize that you play an important role in combating racial profiling, whether it is as an individual or as a local leader in your community. So certainly, if you are interested, please let our teams know, and we will make sure that you are involved in this process. So what are some of the ways you can help? The first thing, of course, is always going to be education on an issue as complicated as this. So it is important that you're aware of the key data and facts and issues that are really rising on this case. And so for the Department of Justice China Initiative and for racial profiling across various federal agencies, right? There is this, what Jin Lang and Ron and many others have mentioned, this chilling effect. And this chilling effect and the fears that folks are feeling are substantiated, right? We know, according to our own study of a June 4th, 2021 review, of the DOJ's own press releases, almost 90% of the defendants are of Asian descent. And a significant percentage of these cases don't include charges of economic espionage or trade secrets, or what we identified as espionage-related crimes. Many include what John had mentioned, these minor or unrelated charges often rooted in non-disclosure. Moreover, there are other studies coming out. A Law 360 study had shown that the China Initiative has increasingly targeted academics, but the overwhelming majority of them are accused of failing to disclose ties to Chinese institutions, not economic espionage. And moreover, the prosecutors have not fared well with many defendants accusing investigators of engaging in some sort of misconduct to bolster what they are saying are weak cases. And so not only are you dealing with these initial indictments and charges, you're also dealing with these concerns of, and allegations of FBI misconduct. Moreover, our organization has helped and worked with over 70 impacted persons directly to ensure that they have access to legal counsel, and also to work with them, whether it be an amicus brief, a support letter, or more information on this issue. We know that this is a very technical space. I want to share that because oftentimes when you're hearing, well, we're not hearing from enough people. The reality is it is very hard to share your stories for something like a China initiative case, right? It's very hard to be undergoing criminal investigation or some sort of prosecution and share your story. So that's why we're able to hear about, Professor An-Ming Hu. His case has gone through the whole trial process. We're able to see everything come out and be revealed during the course of the trial itself. Additionally, we see this chilling effect within the faculty. Ron has mentioned that members, associations representing over 2,000 folks sent a letter to President Biden. Moreover, in Stanford, 177 faculty members have sent a letter to AG Garland. And many more other universities are considering sending a letter of their own to show the impact in their local university. I raise this because as we go through this work, it is important that you work with us to make sure that this information is shared, that all of the facts and data and the stories that we are accumulating that have been really hard to collect, right? These are hard and difficult stories to collect, that we share them. Moreover, it is important for folks to have a good understanding on what is the deterrence of these China initiative cases, right? Folks are being deterred from immigrating to the United States. They're being deterred from applying for federal grants, pursuing a career in STEM fields. We have heard of instances of students not being able to continue their education. And so many of these fears, we can't have them just happen in silence, right? We need to lift up these stories, even when they're anonymous, even when we're not able to provide the names. We need to make sure that the fears that the Asian community and the professors and students are feeling is shared widely. And then in terms of this week, what can you do as an individual, as a civil rights organization to play a role? Tomorrow, we are going to be lifting up several cases. This past Monday, we lifted up Dr. Feng Tao's case, as Jin Liang had mentioned. That has been rescheduled for December 6th. It's absolutely integral that folks come and join. But also tomorrow, we want to make sure that the stories and the traumas that many folks have experienced is not just forgotten. So we're going to be sharing stories of Professor Xiaoxing Shi, Sherry Chen, Dr. Wei Su, and Professor An-Ming Hu. It required so much courage and work for them to share their stories, to write it down, and for their families as well, for it to be out there so publicly. And so it's important that we honor their courage by making sure that we're able to share these stories among our network, that it isn't forgotten. And many of them have shared with us that they have very happy that OCA and Advancing Justice AAJC are able to lift up their stories and share it during our week of action. And we hope you all can also circulate widely in your network. Please join us in our legislative meetings. It's not too late for you to join. Certainly, if folks are interested in training, we would be happy to meet with you and see what we could do to make sure that you're ready and that your peers and colleagues are ready for any Hill visits that you all would like. At the end of the day, leadership, when it comes to local representatives, is really going to be coming from their own constituents, right? And we want to make sure that Congress hears the voice of Asian Americans and immigrant community. So we need your help and we need your leadership. And as you go to these legislative meetings, we hope you can lift up 4 very important asks. First is to end racial profiling, starting with ending the Department of Justice's China initiative, which we consider to be so fundamentally flawed. Second, that the DOJ should immediately halt the initiative to conduct a review of all China initiative prosecutions and investigations closed prior to prosecution to determine whether these cases targeted individuals based on their race, ethnicity, or ancestry. Second, third, that we have to be cautious, right, in the use of anti-China rhetoric. We know there are valid reasons to criticize policies and actions of the Chinese government. We know there are legitimate threats coming from the Chinese government. However, we have also seen throughout this pandemic that broader anti-China statements can contribute to an inflamed hate and bias against Asian Americans. And that's something that our policymakers need to be aware of as they navigate this space. And lastly, really, when it comes to the rules of academic collaboration, they have been changing. We ask that you request that there be this opportunity for folks to just go back and be able to adjust their forms and to provide additional disclosures without these criminal consequences and ramifications and backlash from their universities. It's very important that as there's newer and clearer guidelines, faculty, staff, and scholars have this opportunity to make these corrections. And so we invite you to work with us, to work with OCA, to make sure that these key asks are raised among the policymakers. And of course, as I mentioned before, there are also these allegations of FBI misconduct, right? I want folks, as you read these cases, really ask yourself, how are these cases coming, right? How are federal prosecutors deciding on what cases to investigate? Have they been influenced by race, ethnicity, or national origin? What is the premise for opening a lot of these investigations? And how do we feel about these surveillance activities? Are they justified, or have they just given rise to waste, abuse, or level of harassment? And moreover, are FBI agents providing false or misleading information, right? When we look at these cases, it's not just about the indictments, it's also the ways in which the FBI has conducted themselves during the course of the investigation. Also, if you and your local community want to do action similar to Ron, Advancing Just AJC is here to help you to become a resource. Certainly, we're happy to circulate letters, petitions, or comments. For this week, as Vivian mentioned, we have in the chat box the link to join the letter from the 14 university associations. And additionally, I want to spotlight that Amnesty International also has a petition to end the China initiative. It is not too late. Also, if you have a letter in your inbox and you're trying to find, well, when should I send this, right? If you've worked and talked with your university, with your local community, with your other colleagues, now is a very good time this year, as we have the confirmation from Matt Olson, as many groups are becoming more mobilized. Think about sending that letter. Think about making sure that your voices are heard, but also consider, as you have these letters, the priorities that we have raised in this webinar and how you could incorporate a lot of these top line asks in the work that you're doing. Certainly, if you are worried about your local community, about what is happening, if you yourself feel targeted, feel free to reach out and contact our line, Advancing Justice AAJC, at 202-935-6014 using the Signal app. My colleague will reach out to you. We do have bilingual services, and this service is also supervised by attorneys. And so I want you all to make sure that we are looking at this process in a very responsible way. We are looking into ways that we can reduce risk for you. Make sure to also check out our Know Your Rights information and to share that widely with your network. Information is power, especially for this type of issue. Please share that out. This week of action is a great time for folks to get up to speed on what your rights are if the FBI is knocking on your door. And certainly, please continue to work to mobilize your local community, replicate the efforts that Jinlang has had. Know that we here as national organizations are really here to provide you with the resources and support, and you only need to reach out to us to ask for assistance.
Thank you so much, Gazella, for providing so much comprehensive information on really how to get involved. And I know we are kind of at time here. I did just want to give one quick question over. I think we had someone asking if there is a way to get involved in a local chapter with OCA, whether there is one in Kansas, to get involved in terms of supporting Dr. Tao's trial. And if there is not, maybe it would be great to learn more about how you can start a chapter, an OCA chapter locally.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have a chapter in Kansas right now, but we would love to support you in setting up an OCA chapter. And we do have student affiliates in the Kansas area. And so that could be also your starting base to start an OCA chapter. But an OCA chapter in every 50 states is our goal in the next 3 to 5 years. And so we look forward to it. I'll drop my email in the chat box and feel free to reach out.
Thank you, too. And then I did see a quick question on whether the training that was mentioned by Ghazala, whether that be free. Yes, it is free. And you are, I dropped Ghazala and I's email in the chat box. Please feel free to reach out to us. And also we'll be sending a follow-up email after the webinar. So you'll have our email address on hand there as well in case you need to reach out to us. And yes, and to also shared her email address for you all. And yeah, and there's a, hopefully we'll get a new OCA chapter started in Kansas. So we are a couple minutes over and we are at time. Once again, I want to thank everyone for your participation in today's webinar. Like I mentioned, we'll be sharing additional resources in a follow-up email including a recording of this webinar. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.